on the 30th of June 2022. If I can just take members to the first item on the agenda, which is the election of the chair. So the purpose of this report is to receive nominations for the role of chair for the Corporate Overview and Scrutiny Committee. The Local Government Wales Measure 2011 requires that as a minimum, the chairpersons of these committees be appointed based on the size and political balance of each of these groups that make up the council. At the annual meeting of council on the 19th of May 2022, Councillor Freya Bledsoe, Councillor Paul Davis and Councillor Alex Williams were appointed as the three Subject Overview and Scrutiny Committee chairpersons. The chair of the Corporate Overview and Scrutiny Committee is to be appointed by the members of this committee from one of the chairpersons of the subject committees. However, it cannot be the chairperson representing the executive group. If I take you then to the recommendation at paragraph 9 of the report, the committee is requested to receive nominations and appoint a chairperson of the Corporate Overview and Scrutiny Committee in accordance with provisions as set out in paragraph 3.2 of this report. Can I therefore ask for nominations, please, for the chair from members of the committee?
Sorry, Councillor Ross Thomas's hand.
Yeah, Councillor Thomas.
Thanks, Rachel. I'd like to nominate Councillor Alex Williams, please.
Thank you. Can I have a seconder, please?
Councillor Amanda Williams.
Second.
Yeah, are there any further nominations?
My hand was up to second that. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Councillor Williams. Any further nominations, please? No? I can therefore formally appoint Councillor Alex Williams as the chair of Corporate Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and I will hand over to you, Chair, to take us through the rest of the agenda.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you very much, everyone. Welcome to this Corporate Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting, which, due to health and safety reasons currently being followed in Bridgend County Council, will be held virtually with everyone accessing the meeting from remote locations. The meeting is being recorded and will be available via the Council's website to be viewed subsequently. Please can everyone ensure that mobile phones are switched off or switched to silent mode. Members will have received an electronic copy of the agenda, and I will ask officers to present a summary of the key points. For the record, the agenda can be viewed on the Council's website. Members and officers will be speaking at various points during the meeting, and those speaking may switch their cameras on at that point. But I would ask that, with the exception of myself as chairperson, at all other times you keep your cameras and microphones switched off, as this will help to minimise any background noise and interference. If any members and officers wish to raise a point or question, they should press the raise hands icon at the top right-hand side of the Microsoft Teams window, and I will come to you in the order I receive requests. Please lower your hand once you have finished speaking. The instant messaging chat button has been disabled for this meeting. Please do not use your microphone until I invite you to do so. I will ask officers to introduce themselves when I invite them to speak during the course of the meeting. They too should ensure microphones and cameras are switched off when not in use. I now go to item 2 on the agenda, which are apologies for absence, and I will now ask the scrutiny officer to announce the apologies for absence received. Over to you, Jessica. Councillor Heidi Bennett. Sorry, Jessica. Councillor Heidi Bennett has her hand raised.
Sorry, no.
No, okay, we'll return to Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I've received apologies for absence from Kelly Watson, Chief Officer, Legal and Regulatory Services, HR and Corporate Policy.
Okay, are there any other apologies for absence from members? Okay, we'll now go to item 3 on the agenda, and that's declarations of interest. If any member has an interest to declare in any matter on the agenda, please click on the raise hand icon, and I will come to you in turn for you to declare your interest. We have Councillor Heidi Bennett.
Thank you, Chair. I need to declare a personal interest in agenda item 5 and a prejudicial interest in agenda item 8. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Apologies to Councillor Paul Davis, who was ahead of you, but can come to you now, Paul.
I'll forgive you for that, Councillor Williams. Congratulations on your appointment.
I
it's not a direct relation to any particular agenda item, Chair. It's my partner works for Meals at Home service in the authority. If that does come up in the meeting, I shall be withdrawing from that particular, any discussion around that. It's unlikely, but I just like to put that across for, that, I will be meeting fully otherwise, apart from that.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you very much, Councillor Davis. Councillor Bennett, you still have your hand raised. Would you like to come in again, or was that a legacy hand?
Yes, sorry, Chair, I'm working on 2 different computers. Sorry, I think that I've got the agenda items wrong for my personal interest and prejudicial interest.
Okay.
So just to be clear, I have a personal interest in the revenue budget outturn on which is item 6, and the nomination to Public Service Board. I have a prejudicial interest, which is item 8. I think I've got an updated agenda. Apologies.
Okay, many thanks for the clarification. I appreciate it. Okay, unless there are any other declarations of interest, we'll move to item 4 on the agenda, which is the approval of minutes. Please, can I have a mover and a seconder for each set of minutes? And we'll go to the first set of minutes, which are, sorry, I'm working on a number of different screens as well. So, which are
1st of December.
1st of December 2021.
Yeah, I'll second. I propose those chair as a member of that committee.
Thank you very much, Councillor Pennell-Thomas. And do I have a seconder,
I can
please?
second it as well because I was on the committee too.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Okay, moving to the second set of minutes on the 12th of January 2022. Do I have a mover?
Likewise,
Yeah.
again.
I'm happy to
Thank you,
second
Councillor
them.
Bennett-Thomas, and thank you, Councillor Williams. And finally, the 2nd of March 2022. I believe Councillor Williams and myself were the only ones in attendance at that particular meeting, apart from Councillor Blundell, who isn't in attendance today. So if Councillor Williams is happy to move, I'm happy to second, if that's possible.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm happy to move them.
Okay. I don't know whether it's appropriate, perhaps someone can stop me if it's not, but can I just raise a point with regards to the minutes, and that is to ensure that we have an action log following the minutes, because a number of recommendations came out of the committee, and to ensure that we actually follow up on the actions. So I don't know whether someone from Scrutiny can come in at this point and ensure that the actions which were reported have actually been followed up on.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the minutes, as I say, there's been a delay with the minutes, but the actual actions and outcomes were reported at the time following the meetings, and the recordings were published immediately after the meetings. And there's a standing item on the agenda in the from the second round of meetings onwards, which will have the recommendations monitoring tracker, so to show that the responses have been the recommendations have been responded to, etc.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, Meryl. I appreciate it. Okay, moving to item 5 on the agenda then, and that is the call-in of the Cabinet decision for the Recycling and Waste Service contract post-2024. I will now ask the Democratic Services Manager to introduce the report and the role of the Scrutiny Committee in calling in this decision.
Thank you, Chair.
Great. Yep, Rachel's taking this. Thank you very much, Rachel. Over to
Thank
you.
you, Chair. Thanks. So the purpose of this report is to enable the committee to consider the decision of Cabinet taken at its meeting on the 14th of June 2022 in relation to the report on recycling and waste service post 2024. In accordance with Rule 18 of the Overview and Scrutiny Procedure Rules in the Council's Constitution, 3 members of the Overview and Scrutiny and the Scrutiny Chair have requested that an executive decision made by Cabinet on the 14th of June be called in. The Cabinet decision record, notice of call-in and the Cabinet report are attached as appendices. As set out in paragraph 18F of the Council's Constitution, the role of Scrutiny Committee today in calling in a decision is to test the merits of the decision, to consider the process by which the decision has been formulated, to make recommendations to support the decision, change aspects of the decision, or to invite the decision-making person or body to reconsider, 3, to suggest further steps before a decision is made, but not try to carry out those steps in place of the decision-making person or body. Or to come to a view in relatively short timescale so as not to compromise the speed and efficiency of the decision-making process. If I can then take members to the recommendation, please, at paragraph 9, the committee is recommended to consider the Cabinet decision of the 14th of June 2022 relating to the Recycling and Waste Service post 2024 and to determine whether it wishes to refer the decision back to Cabinet for reconsideration, setting out in writing the nature of its concerns, or to decide not to refer the matter back to Cabinet. I'll therefore hand you back to the Chair to invite members and officers to speak on the subject. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I will now ask members who signed the notice of call-in to speak on their reasons why the decision has been called in. So I would ask you to raise your hand if you wish to speak now. Councillor Martin Williams.
Thank you.
I think you're on mute, Martin.
Yeah, apologies. Thank you, Chair. Excuse my sniffing as COVID departs, quitey hay fever lands, I'm afraid. So you'll have to bear with me. Yeah, I mean, the first thing I want to say about this call-in is that it certainly is not it's got nothing to do with what may or may not happen after 2026. It is absolutely focused on the decision made for the interim period between 2024 when Kia exit and what may or may not happen in 2026. I think there are three broad aspects here, two fairly specific ones, and perhaps a broader third aspect, which I hope to summarise now. The first thing that strikes me is that it was almost a fait accompli. The paper was presented as though the only option was to procure a short-term contract. Well, I think we all know that that's not the only option. What we haven't had is any discussion of the alternatives. We don't know the merits, for example, of at the expiry of the Kia contract, to being the workforce and bringing the service in-house as a temporary measure, which would allow the authority to tailor the service towards what future provision may be. It may also be cheaper, but we don't know because we didn't have any figures. And it may also be less disruptive because it may well be that in 2026, and the mood music seems to be that there is a desire, perhaps in certain circles, to have it in-house beyond 2026. Well, you can have two disruptions in that case. You'd have the 2P, the contract award, all of that sort of ramping up of the contract in 2024, only then to be people back in and ramp down the contract in 2026. So that basic model, to my view, hasn't been considered by Cabinet. Whether it's been considered prior to Cabinet, I don't know, but it certainly hasn't been wasn't considered in the recording we looked at last week. Let's assume for a moment that the decision is correct to outsource. We then have a strange and perhaps messy situation where we are outsourcing a contract for service only, but yet the Cabinet has agreed or authorised the purchase of the existing Kia plant. So then you have a messy situation where you have a contractor reliant upon plant or operating plant that the authority owns. It's old plant. What happens when there's breakdowns, liabilities? It's to me, it's a recipe for a contractual mess. So those are the things that I don't think were properly considered. I just checked my notes if there was anything on that line as well. There may well be. Perhaps others will pick that up. The other perhaps on that line was the whole thing about the purchase of the plant. Why do we want to purchase old kit? We don't have any alternative as to whether we're better off buying new, whether we're better off, if we go down an outsourced route, getting an all-in contract which supplies plant and labour. And also the leasing of plant. Why do we want to take Kia's old rubbish off them, for want of a better word, when we could lease brand new fuel efficient or even a low emissions or even electric vehicles? So I think maybe a missed opportunity there. But the long and the short of it, it's not a principled argument really either way. It's clear to me that it wasn't, the alternatives were neither considered nor presented. The second one, which I have a little bit more of a principled objection to, is the 75,000 per annum revenue, additional revenue cost for the HVO. Yes, we have a it's incumbent on us to do what we can, all we can, to reduce our carbon emissions and to be more efficient. But this does seem to me to be a misguided decision. £75,000 per year. Now, I don't know whether that's, it was unclear in the paper whether that's our share or whether that's the total and we pay half of that. But over 2 years, it's £150,000 of additional cost. Why are we subsidising Kia? If they want to do that, it's their contract, let them do it. And two, there are far better ways of spending that money in a cost of living crisis. And I don't think that it's been properly considered against the backdrop of families who are going to food banks and you hear stories of people telling the cashier to stop scanning when they hit 30 quid in Asda. So I think in all ways there's no obvious direct benefit to subsidising Kia for this HVO. We should either just not do it at all, or we should spend that money on other means. Why can't we put in more electric charging points? Why can't we buy sensors for lights in council offices, for example? There are far better ways of spending £75,000 and saving the environment, for want of a better description. I think my third more general point is that, and it was a comment on the paper as such. Now, as many of us here may well have done, have either sat on approval bodies or presented to approval bodies. And I'm afraid this paper was insufficient to allow an approving body, the Cabinet, to make properly informed decisions. There was no discussion at all, or no tabling of the do nothing option. I think we all know what the do nothing option was, but it was not tabled, and there was no tabling or consideration of alternatives. There was no mention of cost, so other than the HVO, and so we don't know what the procurement exercise will cost. We don't know what the projected or the estimated contract cost will be over the 2 years. We don't know whether that contract may have a clause to extend beyond 2026. And we don't know the profit that we expect that contractor to make. So there are a whole lot of unknowns that, frankly, if I was presenting the paper, I would expect it to be rejected in my workplace. And if I was on the receiving end of that paper, I would have dismissed it out of hand for those reasons alone. But that's my general point. I think there's a lot in there. But the summary is, I don't think that the Cabinet was in a position to make an informed decision because the paper simply didn't present them with the options. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much for that summary, Councillor Williams. Before I call Councillor Bledsoe, I can see Councillor Griffiths has got his hand raised. Just to announce to members that the process for this particular item will be that I will ask the members who called in the decision to speak on the item first. I will then ask the Cabinet member responsible for this area and any other Cabinet members who wish to contribute to speak, followed by the Corporate Director, the Chief Executive, or the officers, whoever would like to speak, followed by supplementary questions by those members of the committee only who called in the item, and then I will open it out to other committee members to contribute. So, Councillor Griffiths, if you could lower your hand for now, and I'll come to you after that process is concluded. So I'll go to Councillor Stephen Bledsoe now.
Thank you, Chair. And just to echo the congratulations on your appointment to this position.
Thank you.
I would like to echo all of Councillor Martin Williams's points, but especially the second point that he raised over the additional costs to this and the lack of, I don't want to use the word justification, but the lack of detail based around that amount. There was a figure of £75,000 attributed to a potential saving to our carbon footprint or our carbon output, but there was no direct relation to where £75,000 could be spent elsewhere and whether that could save more carbon from there. Just as a personal bugbear of mine, we are looking to use this as justification for £75,000 additional spend, yet we are leaving lights on in car parks overnight when nobody is in them. Now that has two benefits, to cost and to the carbon output. So if we are going to use £75,000, justifying it by the savings it will make. I want to know through proper scrutiny what £75,000 could save. Could that save more carbon in another area? That wasn't detailed in any way in the paper. So I would like to reinforce Councillor Williams's points on those. But what I would like to say, Chair, is that scrutiny and this calling in process is actually not a negative thing, and I hope it isn't seen as such. The last contract that was awarded for collection to Kia had errors in there. There was no provision for the collection of sanitary waste, and a retro scheme had to be implemented with purple bags, which for the last 5 years our residents have had problems with. There was no provision in that previous Kia contract for the cleaning of food waste bins in communal waste areas. And now we have our residents in our town and our county living with food waste bins that haven't been cleaned for 3 years, and with no stakeholder willing to step up and clean those. Scrutiny, and as members of this committee, you'll all be aware of this, is actually a positive thing. And sometimes these things need the input of 51 elected councillors to look to see whether there are any other mistakes in this decision. People may think that there's no mistakes in here, and officers and cabinet members may have made the decision in good faith. But however, scrutiny from this committee and all elected members could actually be a good thing, and an important thing in something as important as this. This decision will affect our residents for the term of the decision, and we need to ensure that the decision is made fully and without any potential gaps. Scrutiny of this decision may lead to the fact that everything is okay to proceed. However, we will only know that if scrutiny happens, and that is why I very heartily lent my signature to this call-in, because from past experience and from reading the papers, there could be potential holes in here, and we as an authority need to make sure on behalf of our residents that that isn't the case and doesn't happen. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bledsoe. I will now ask the Cabinet member or any other Cabinet members to outline the reasons for the decision in response to the reasons given in the notice of calling, and then extend the invitation to the officers, the Chief Executive, Corporate Director, or any other officers to set out the rationale behind the decision in more detail. So I invite the Cabinet member to speak.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the committee. And let me say at the outset that I welcome and wholeheartedly embrace scrutiny and questions and being part of this process on this subject or any other subject. It's integral to how we operate as a council. And also to highlight right at the beginning that there's quite a lot of discussion of the previous two speakers talking about the past, and we can learn from the past, but we look in the future here. And the only decision that's been made in the Cabinet report was to seek tenders as part of the process going forward. So it's all we're doing at this moment in time is seeking tenders. No decisions have been made about how the contract may look in the future, whether it's a contract, whether it's in-house, whether it's an arm's length company. And those options were in the paper. It's clearly there. I mentioned the various parts, and it's not a fait accompli. This is just the start of the process to decide how we take this forward. But yeah, I don't know if you'd like me to take each of the questions that were or the reasons for calling one by one. I'll go through them all in one go. Do you want to just?
Yeah, if you would like to just make a response to all of the reasons for calling, Councillor Spanswick, and then any members who called in the decision, and other committee members can respond following the officers' supplementary responses to yours.
So as you just said, that first part of the initially what we've done here 14th of June was to agree to authorise officers to go out and seek tenders for an interim 2-year contract. That's all that's been agreed. That's one of the agreements, one of the motion recommendations. There was reference. There's no alternative options have been looked at, considered. Well, I can assure you, behind the scenes, all options are being discussed and have been discussed prior to myself being a cabinet member. There's various reasons why, at this moment in time, a short 2-year contract is the quickest, easiest, and probably the cheapest option. Not saying personally that's the best option at this moment in time, but that is where currently the advice, the professional advice given is the probably the best value option. We're in uncertain times. We don't know where we're going to be moving on from 2026. Welsh Government targets on collections and methodology and what's best for Bridgend. And that links partly to the vehicles. The current vehicles, they've still got some life left in them, and will after 2024. And the idea is to sweat that asset. And they are specific bespoke vehicles. They're not something off the shelf. You can just say to a contractor, give us a new set of these vehicles. And those bespoke vehicles may change depending on the type of collection, the type of service post 2026. So the idea at the moment is to not change the service from 2024, just keep it exactly as it is. But there may be opportunities for slight tweaks in areas like Ware Mill, where the communal collection areas and problems, there may be slight tweaks possible. But the main focus is that the vehicles stay as they are. Okay, they are getting on, but there's still life left in them. There's negotiation take place for the value of those vehicles, but that nothing changes in 24 to 26. The real change and the real challenge will be what we do after that. There's the discussion about no cost benefit analysis being undertaken. Well, that's part of what we are currently doing. One step, let's get tenders in and see what's out there. While at the same time, in parallel to that, we are looking and will be looking at the other options of what can be done about bringing the service back in-house at a date in the future. And there's a lot of work behind the scenes to be done on that. As members will be aware, new members hopefully will soon become aware and are aware, and definitely past members, resources are very thin within the Community Directorate, so there will need to be additional resources probably brought in to help with taking the service forward and looking at all the options. There was a question about the procurement costs. Currently, there's a earmark reserved of £300,000 for procurement of a future contract. A tiny percentage that will probably be spent because currently the procurement costs are all being dealt with in-house. So we're talking a minor amount of money will be spent at this moment in time, but long term there will need to be a large amount spent on procuring either a new contract, putting that together, or the work that will need to be done to look at bringing the in-house solutions, whether that's directly or through an arm's length company, and there will need to be external support sought to help with that. There's the discussion about the hydrogenated vegetable oil, or biodiesel 2, I think it might even be called. There's a lot of work going on, and has gone on and still going on in the background with ourselves and other organisations looking at what's the best for the future. Whether that's value for money, 75k, the 75k at the moment for 1,000 tonnes of carbon. I understand that is to be split between us and the contractor. So it's not £75,000 per annum to Bridgend PCVC. It'll hopefully be 50% of that. Now, whether that's value for money, that's a judgment call that can be taken, and accept the fact that maybe other options we look at what can we get for £75,000. But we are in the early stages. Well, not in the early stages. We've got 7 years, just over 7 years left to get net carbon zero, and we've got Bridgend County Council close on 30,000 tonnes of carbon we've got to find over and above what's already decided we can do. But that's one that welcomes scrutiny further on that. And lastly, Chair, I want to make it clear again, it's not fait accompli. There's no decision being made as yet on what happens post 2024. The decision has been made is to seek tenders while at the same time in parallel looking at all the other options and getting the other work done behind the scenes. And I can assure you, if all that was put in the cabinet report, well, how many members would read it for a start? But there's lots of questions, work, challenge going on behind the scenes, and I can assure you, I will be there challenging every step to make sure we get the best value and the best service for people of Bridgend, whether that's in-house, which I tend to prefer, or if it's external and that's best value and the best service, that's the direction we should travel. But there'll be further scrutiny, I'm sure, on that in the future, and there will be further cabinet reports in it. And I welcome the sort of scrutiny of that. So, Chair, I'll leave it at that at the moment, but I'm happy to take any questions on any point.
Thank you very much, Councillor Spanswick. Can I invite any other cabinet member who wishes to contribute? Councillor Howard-Williams, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think my hand is up. Okay, I'll just lower that. How do I do it? Lower. Okay, yeah, thank you, Chair. And just to support, I suppose, what Councillor Spanswick have said, that this is purpose of the report then is a information gathering exercise, because, you know, what we need is good sound evidence on which to base our decisions, and we can only do that by testing the market and seeing what interest is out there in collecting our waste for the 2-year period between 24 and 26. Now, the reasons for that short extension have been well rehearsed, I believe. They were actually a subject for a scrutiny committee back in July of 21. And the reasons there of the future Welsh Government recycling targets, producer responsibility, deposit return schemes, and vehicle types, those reasons are still valid today because there's still uncertainty over what the shape of the collection is going to be post 26. And what we need to be very mindful of is that we keep in line with our procurement law. And no, it is very difficult because any decisions can be challenged and they will be challenged. There's an army of legal experts out there that are quite ready then to challenge any procurement contracts that are not in line with procurement law, and therefore there would be no change to the method of collection post 24. But because of those uncertainties around what waste will we be expected to collect, then we need that commitment, I suppose, and that certainty from Welsh Government in order to shape the future contract. So it is purely an information gathering exercise, and you know, this will, I'm sure, come to future scrutiny committees, and there'll be much discussion over the coming months. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. I can see members are very keen on intervening, but as I mentioned earlier, the process is that I will now invite any other Cabinet member who wishes to speak, followed by the officers, and then ask whether any member who called in the decision, whether they would like to make any supplementary remarks before I call other committee members to intervene. So I'd like you to lower your hands for now, if you may. Would any other Cabinet member like to intervene before I call an officer? I can't see any hands raised from the Cabinet, so I would like to call Mark Shepherd to address the meeting.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members, for your contributions so far. I'll keep this relatively brief, Councillor Williams. I think it's probably important that we answer the questions of members, but just perhaps to reinforce and reiterate a couple of points that have been made by Councillor Spanswick. I think the first thing is that context is really important here. I don't think this has been mentioned, but essentially the decision that was made previously was that it was our intention to extend the contract with Kier for 2 years, which was an option in the existing contract, because of the uncertainties that have been described by Councillor Spanswick and Councillor Williams, particularly around Welsh Government recycling targets, particularly around the need to move towards less diesel reliant vehicles and all of the producer provider type responsibilities that may come. So the original intention was that that would be extended. When that became apparent last autumn that that wasn't going to be an option, because Kier essentially said, well, we're moving out of the market, we're not interested. Timescales dictated to some extent that our options at that point were more limited. I think we felt that we were not in a position to be able to determine what a long-term future contract would look like. That would require public consultation, that would require a process that is lengthy and quite complex. And so our options essentially at this point are relatively limited. They are, and this is why the report was put forward, they are to procure a short-term contract, and therefore that option has been kept open by Cabinet approving that way forward. I think Councillor Spanswick has said to you, there may be, and it remains to be seen, there may be an alternative of potentially in parallel to that, looking at whether the service could be brought in-house. But just be clear, that would be very much using whoever provides the service, be very much about using the same vehicles and the same methodology predominantly for that 2-year period, because we do not have time to change all of those things for that interim period. So essentially what we're talking about here is very much an interim period. A number of the points that have been made then about post-26, I don't disagree with. That will require us to do a lot of work, a lot of understanding of what it would require to increase our recycling targets. I think I should emphasise, incidentally, that we remain one of the best performing authorities in Wales in terms of recycling, but also in terms of cost and in terms of miscollection. So it's not a popular narrative necessarily, but actually on the whole, it's a successful contract. So I think in sort of the context of what I've said, I think that leads to why some of the other things that have been raised are not possible. The point has been made about bespoke vehicles. It's a really important point, because actually you simply can't buy the vehicles to meet our methodology off the shelf. You can't lease them. You have to design and procure them, and that isn't cost effective for new vehicles for a 2-year period, when we may then change the methodology a few years on. So we are advised that the vehicles we have sufficient life left in them. They were actually introduced on a phased basis, if you recall, at the beginning of the last contract. So some of them aren't 7 years old, some of them are 6 years old, some of them slightly less than that. So there is a sensible way forward in using the existing plant and equipment. The HVO fuel cost issue, I'll allow others to answer, because they'll know more about the specifics than me, but I suppose I'd make the general point that you, Councillor Williams, and many others were part of calling a climate crisis in the authority. I think it's a fair point about are there alternatives, but generally what I'd say to you is that we have to take action, and I'm advised in terms of the carbon reduction that this is a very low cost in terms of the carbon reduction result compared to some of the other more difficult decisions we may have to make over the next 5 years or so if we are to meet our carbon reduction targets by 2030. So I think this will be an ongoing running cost, and it's right that it's scrutinised, but ultimately, we won't achieve the change that we need unless we make some difficult decisions along the way. And the final point I'd make, I think, is there's a general comment about lack of detail, and while I understand it, I mean, I don't think if you looked at the suite of cabinet reports on that date, I don't think this one suffered compared to any other in terms of detail and options. I mean, they are by their very nature summaries. We don't include everything. Maybe we don't always get it right in terms of the level of detail, but that's not an intentional thing to either prevent information coming forward or to deceive. There would have been other reports in that suite that I'm sure members would have supported, but equally didn't have options such as do nothing or whatever else. I mean, we're essentially bringing forward recommendations to Cabinet based on professional advice, based on knowledge, and I'd want to reassure you therefore that those other options have been looked at, and indeed I believe, looking back at the scrutiny report of last July, they were covered in some detail actually about what the options may be. So I think it's probably better, Chair, if we answer specific questions from elected members, but I hope that's helpful as just an overall summary and context to how we got to this position.
Thank you very much, Mark. Would any other officer like to contribute before I bring members in? Can't see any hands raised. I would ask you to lower your hands, please, because I'm now going to, as I said with the process, I think Councillor Jane Gebby, the Deputy Leader, would like to come in, so I'll happily take her. Unfortunately, Councillor Bledsoe, you're not a member of the committee, so you wouldn't be able to ask another supplementary question. I can only take supplementary questions from members of the committee who called in the item. So I'd like to ask you to lower your hand, but I will bring in the Deputy Leader, Councillor Jane Gebby, at this stage.
Thank you very much, Councillor Williams, and indeed I would like to congratulate you on your appointment today. I think it's really, I think we need to be really clear that as a council, we need to move business along. We will be, everybody knows that my background was trade unions. I'm fully versed with consultation, public and with the workforce. There is no way that we would actually get a system and a set of options in place meeting all of Welsh Government standards that we don't actually know what they are yet. And I would also take you to 9.5 of the original report, where actually what we've done is authorised officers to come back to us with a future recommendation on how the service is run. I think we also need to note that during the pandemic, and everybody is aware of the cost of drivers, Kia Contract actually had to put up their salary rates for all their drivers. So there's another added implication for us. I just think we need to be clear about what we're doing and why we're doing it. As we haven't got targets yet, I don't understand how we would be able to meet a sustainable option at this point. And we need to make use of what we have currently. Thank you very much for your indulgence, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Gebbie. And can I ask whether there are any other Cabinet members or officers who would like to contribute before I bring in members who have called in the decision? I can't see any hands, so I'd like to invite any committee members who called in the decision if they wish to ask questions. And I can see Councillor Amanda Williams has raised her hand, so we'll go to Councillor Williams.
Thanks very much. Apologies, I've had to switch to my phone because my Wi-Fi has been going in and out this morning. I've got a list of questions, if possible, please.
Just on that, Councillor Williams, can I suggest, with your permission, if we take question by question, so we can gain full responses to them, and so that the officers can respond in detail to them. Otherwise, they may not capture everything that you've raised.
No problem, and I've grouped them in areas.
Okay, that's great.
But the purpose really of this calling, just to make it clear, is because at the moment we're in a cost of living crisis, and I think now more than ever we need to be clear to the public that we are spending the way we should be spending for their benefits. And I think that's why you might have made the decisions in the background and agreed everything, but we need to be showing the public that those decisions are there so they can also see that as well. So my first questions are on the cost of procurement. We've said that could be up to £300,000 in this meeting. I mean, that figure wasn't known before, so that's something that's come out as a result of this call-in. What is the estimated contract cost, and how much profit do they think such a contractor would make? Because on this basis, what sort of contractor would take on a 2-year contract, and what happens if no one comes forward? So that's my first section of questions, please.
Okay, I'll come to Councillor Spanswick, and then I'll come to Mark Shepherd, our Chief Executive. Councillor Spanswick.
Thank you, Chair. And just to clarify, the statement I made was there's a earmarked reserve of £300,000 for the future procurement tender process. That is not anywhere near what's been spent or would be spent on this current process. It's been done in-house, so that there's not £300,000 being spent. There's just a earmarked reserve available for the future of that amount for the process for the future contracts for waste management. So please, can we make that sure that's corrected?
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Spanswick. Mark Shepherd, Chief Executive.
Yes, thank you. I won't add much to that. I think the EMR is reserved on the basis that, again, we don't fully know what option we're taking. The option we're taking here in terms of a 2-year contract is the cheapest in terms of procurement, because essentially the contract is already written and we're using internal procurement and legal staff to move that forward. And we don't tend to identify in any cabinet report when we're using internal resource what the cost of a procurement is. We have a procurement department, we have a legal department, it's done within house. So let's be clear, it's not the 300,000. What I would say, and this is of course part of the process of considering options, is if and when we determine, for example, that we want to bring it in-house, then the procurement cost would be much higher, because we would then, for example, have to procure up to 70 waste streams ourselves, rather than doing it through companies that already have those kind of procurements in place. So let's be absolutely clear, we're not spending £300,000 procuring this interim contract. That will be a minimal cost based on the existing contract, the existing methodology, using internal staff.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Back to Councillor Williams for another supplementary question.
Yeah, the second part of the question I've just asked hasn't been answered. It was, what is the estimated contract cost? What's this going to cost us to go out for a 2-year contract? basically what sort of profits are these companies making, because who's going to want to take on a 2-year contract, and what happens if nobody comes forward? Those questions weren't asked, first of all.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Williams. I'll go back to Mark.
And my apologies, Councillor Williams. I was answering the first part. The second part of it is clearly we don't know precisely. We've done some soft market testing, which indicates that there are companies interested in taking on a 2-year contract. I think it'd be naive to think that there isn't a profit margin, because these are commercial companies, so of course there is. But we don't know. What we do know is that contractually, all of our current contracts, for example, home to school transport contracts, all of our contracts using vehicles, the cost has gone up significantly. So I think we can probably anticipate that the cost will be higher than it is now, whatever the methodology. But of course, the purpose of going to the market and in parallel also looking at the alternatives is to determine whether the costs that come back are best value for money, and that is, I suppose, what Councillor Spanswick was alluding to earlier. But the truth is, we need to go to the market, don't we, to determine what people come in with as a cost for this 2-year interim period.
Thank you, Mark. Councillor Williams.
Right, next question based on that that topic. The report to me, when I read it, is saying we are going for an interim 2-year contract. Have we not looked at the possibility, and could it still be a possibility that we bring this in-house in 2024? That's my next question. Thanks.
Okay, can I ask for someone to contribute? Mark, Councillor Spanswick, which one would you like to take it? Mark first.
Well, apologies, I don't want to hog this. More than happy others answer. I think the point is, Councillor Williams, it may be an opportunity, it may be an option. The truth is we don't know, and what we're going to have to do, I think, is commission to some support about feasibility to determine whether it's realistic and indeed whether it's sensible to bring it in-house in that 2-year period. I think, again, just to separate the two things, if we're looking longer term from 2026, it clearly is possible and it clearly is an option that should be considered fully. But I suppose the point I was trying to make was that what we can't do is end up with no options. So the option of going out for a 2-year interim contract is important regardless, because you have to have that in your back pocket. Otherwise, the worst scenario of all, of course, be ending up with no provision and no service. So there may be a possibility of bringing it in-house, but I wouldn't want to underestimate the fact that this authority has not had an in-house waste service since 2003. I don't think any of us were around then, but you know, there were reasons why it went out. There may be good reasons why it comes back in. But of course, the reality is over a 20-year period, we no longer have either the infrastructure or the staffing. So we would have to very seriously consider a programme of works and investment that would be required to bring it back in-house. And of course, that may well be an option. But at this point in time, as of now, the recommendation to Cabinet is that you absolutely must go out for a procurement for a 2-year contract, and it takes that long. Because if we didn't do that, we'd have no option at all, would we? We'd simply have a contract that ends, and then we would be in an emergency situation.
Thank you, Mark. I'll now call Councillor Spanswick, the Cabinet member.
Thank you, Chair. And it's a valid question, and it's one that I've asked myself, and we made inquiries, and I'm advised at the moment that the timescale is very short to 2024. And I've done some research looking at around the country at other authorities who've brought things back in-house, and it appears to be at a minimum of 2 years, if not more, to go through the process to bring this back in-house, which cut it, well, we're less than 2 years away. And also, as we mentioned earlier, I think Mark said we're looking at 76 different waste streams for procurement, and the timescale for doing that is very tight to try and get it done in less than 2 years. So while that might be an ideal option in some people's views, and yeah, okay, there are again limited hands on deck, limited resources, and the timescale is almost impossible to get to that stage. And valid question, and it can cut through you. It has been asked and challenged behind the scenes. But we're not in that position where it's easily to move that direction. I think Zach might raise his hand as well. I'm not sure. Can clarify more about these procurement streams, which are frightening the amount of work that needs to be done there.
Yes, happy to bring you in, Zach, now.
Yeah, so on that point, firstly, for members that were in place prior to the recent elections, as a reminder, and for all new members that probably wouldn't be aware, I would highlight that back in July 21, when we had our scrutiny report, where we first explored what was the then
proposed 2-year extension with Kia, questions were asked then about the option of, well, couldn't we just bring it in-house for that duration? In fact, I think if memory serves, I think it was actually Councillor Spanswick that was asking that question at the time. And what I would reiterate is we had already, with the then Cabinet Member for Communities, committed to coming back to scrutiny to fully explore all of the options, including, bringing the service in-house, but not for that immediate duration of the immediate 2 years. And as explained then, there's an awful lot to it. It's a big, big decision, and it's a big piece of work. The scale of work to bring the service back in-house compared to the procurement are on two totally different quantums. I think it's been mentioned here, there's over 70, there's 76, I know the number, 76 individual supply agreements that Kia have in the performance of that contract. They're not all related to waste streams. Some of them are related to software packages for routing, you name it, all the different things that you need to run a contract. That's a huge amount of procurement to be undertaken. We need a whole team of people to do that we haven't even got at the moment. And, obviously all of the staffing and TUPE issues, contractual issues, etc., that would have to be worked through. Now, it's going to be a really, really big, worthwhile debate. Which way do we go in future? Is it going to be an in-house model? Should it be an arm's length company model? Should it continue to be outsourced? Lots of pros and cons to be considered. But to undertake that for this, we know we just need a short-term arrangement with the existing vehicles. That makes perfect sense because of all of the uncertainties at the moment. There are things that I couldn't even go and procure properly at the moment to get best value. So if you talk about material streams, if I go out to, say, the marketplace to say, right, I want to recycle plastic. Well, how much plastic do I want to recycle? Well, I know what it is today, but there's the potential for a deposit return scheme to come on the agenda, extended producer responsibilities, all things that could change the tonnage in the future. So the truth is, I don't even know what my future tonnage is going to be in the long term to go out and procure with. So for all those reasons, doing those things right now just don't make a great deal of sense. But they are debates for the future, and they are things that we have at scrutiny meeting already committed to debating at length, just not for that immediate short-term fix that we're talking about here.
Thank you very much, Zach. And now return to Councillor Williams for the next group of questions.
I just want to come back on that. A couple of things. It went to scrutiny 2021. I think that was the update on the contract, and it was almost decided, so it wasn't really asking for a decision. So at that point, we would have had 3 years to look at the potential of bringing it back in-house if the recommendations came forward that have we looked at in-house. But to clarify, Zach just said he hasn't got staff to do procurement, and yet we're told the cost of procurement is going to be minimal because they're doing it in-house. So firstly, I'd like clarification on that, because it can't be one or the other.
Okay, Mark, Zach.
No.
Go on, Zach.
I think we're mixing up two things then. There's the procurement for the extension, which is a single procurement exercise. So that's one procurement exercise. Yes, we can do that. We have the staff to do that. What we're saying is bringing it in-house. There are 76 individual supply streams. And to do that level of procurement, right now, as I sit here today, no, I haven't got the staff to be able to do that. We would need a team of people working on it, if we were looking at the bring in-house models. So that's the difference. One procurement exercise or 76 different procurement exercises to bring it in-house, one of which we can handle, one of which we could handle, but we would need a level of resource and investment.
Okay, would you like to supplement that, Mark, or are you happy?
Apologies, Chair, Zach's answered it, thank you.
Okay, Councillor Williams.
Thanks. So what it says to me then is that we haven't really got a realistic option of coming in-house in 2026, because there's an awful lot of work to be done in 4 years as well. If it couldn't be done in 2 years or 3 years, how's it going to be done in 4 years when we haven't even got a team? But on to the next set of questions. Do we know what the suspected cost of buying back the fleet is? Because we've given, Cabinet gave authority for those to, for the fleet to be bought back and for officers to make their own decisions. It was delegated. So on that basis as well, how old is the fleet and will it be usable in 2026 if we're spending £150,000 to convert to HVO? Will we be able to use these vehicles in 2026, or are we only converting for the two years because we may need new equipment? And is the cost of converting the vehicles to HVO, is that included in the 75k per annum, or is that just the running costs of them?
Okay, thank you, Councillor Williams. Councillor Spanswick, followed by Zach.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to come back to the end, the off-the-cuff remark of Councillor Amanda Williams, and there's a difference between 2024 and 26 by 2 years. So there is an option of in-house. Just to say there's not an option, that's why we're talking about the longer period, which is 4 years, not 2, to look and do all the work behind the scenes in parallel with the current 2-year option. So to say there's not an option up 26 is a foolish remark, to be honest.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Spanswick. That's it.
Take that. I've just been called foolish in a public meeting, and I have to take offence at that. So if I could just come back on that, what I'm saying is I'm told we don't have a team in for procurement. So if we haven't got a team in for the procurement of bringing this in-house because it takes so much more work, we cannot be considering this because we haven't said we're even interviewing or looking to increase our term. So to say I'm foolish, I would expect an apology from Councillor Spanswick. Sorry.
My apologies, Chair. It was not meant in that respect. What I'm saying, that it is a realistic option and they are being looked at. To say we're not is incorrect.
Let's try and keep the best of order and raise hands if you wish to speak, otherwise it'll descend into mayhem. So I'm going to go to Zach now to answer Councillor Williams's question.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of points then on what was raised that I made note of here. So one was about vehicle costs. We don't know the exact cost of what the purchase of the fleet will be, but it's also not it's not a blank sheet of paper where we've no idea. Essentially, the contract, as was written, allows us the option to buy back fleet, and some indicative costs are contained within that contract. If the exact fleet makeup that Kia operated was exactly the same as what was predicted at the start of the tender, then I could tell you the exact figure, but it invariably it isn't. You know, when they actually roll out the contract, they end up, virtually every contractor or local authority ends up having a varying fleet profile, and actually it changes over the years with property growth. So it means it will change slightly, but we have an indication of what the vehicle purchase costs will be per type of vehicle. So we have an indication of that. In terms of age, the vehicles will be 6 to 6.5 years old at the end of the contract. How long can you run them for? Well, these days, quite a lot of waste collection contractors are running these vehicles up to 10 years. I personally wouldn't recommend it because the further on you go, there's no getting away from it. Costs a bit more to maintain them, and your reliability issues start to creep in. So you don't want to really push them too far, but we'll be taking these vehicles up to sort of about 8.5 years old, which is a reasonable expectation. You know, we're comfortable with that. We wouldn't be recommending it if we wouldn't. We've looked at what types of issues are we likely to have. Mileage wise, these vehicles compared to other long distance LGV trucks with similar engines don't do huge mileage. Consumables, brakes and clutches, will they get replaced anyway as a matter of course? They're not particularly expensive. We will possibly have a few gearbox issues that we'd have to accommodate within the contract. But generally, yes, we're more than comfortable. Bottom line is we understand it and we're more than comfortable that these vehicles can run for a few more years, and that makes good economic sense. And for a fraction of a price of new vehicles, we'll be able to run these older vehicles and get ourselves to a point where the ultra low emissions marketplace changes. And that's the big thing. That's the big point that was in the, you know, the original cabinet report that's just gone and was previously stated in the scrutiny report previously, is right now the ultra low emissions vehicles marketplace is developing. Those vehicles, you know, to buy waste collection vehicles, they're hugely expensive. You know, whereas a diesel powered one off the shelf at the moment might cost you 160, 170,000 pound, you're virtually talking double that to buy the ultra low emission equivalent, whether that's electric or hydrogen. And at the moment, neither of those options are well, certainly hydrogen is much more embryonic. There's some coming into the UK now, but it's really early days. Electric's a little bit more common, and they tend to work quite well in city centre collection areas, but have issues, you know, going the sorts of distances we have up our valleys and sort of across to Swansea where we have to tip the waste. So we know that vehicle marketplace needs to develop more, and hence the need to buy ourselves a little bit more time. And the most sensible way of doing that is absolutely to use those existing vehicles, sweat the asset. It's cost effective to do so. They've got the lifespan in them. It makes perfect sense. You can't just go and hire those sorts of vehicles off the shelf. You know, you can with the refuse trucks, but you can't with the recycling ones. This bespoke, you know, their configuration of compartments is actually aligned to the tonnages and materials that Regen produces, you know, in terms of cardboard, plastics, and all of the things that we put out. So yeah, absolutely, it makes sense to just sweat that asset and get a couple of more years out of those vehicles. I think there was a point on the 75k and the fuel costs as well. That's been made a few times. I think one of the earlier points on it is a really good one. How do we know that's good value? You know, I think it's really good value, you know, in terms of the carbon benefit. The carbon benefit is nearly 1,000 tonnes per annum. And the investment was not 75k, it's 75k total cost, but we're going to look to share that with Kia, and that's the negotiation that we asked for permission to go and have. I think something we should do in future, you know, is of all of these, you know, sort of carbon reduction schemes, look at, well, what's the cost per tonne of carbon reduced? So we can compare and contrast different schemes. And I think that's a really good measure that we ought to start to use in the future. Typically, I think in the past, we've invested in areas when the opportunities come along. So we invested in our street lighting change into LEDs when Salex funding became available for that and the marketplace developed. Similarly, when money became available, we invested 1.3 million in our fixed assets, in our buildings and our schools with the refit programme. But we've kind of done those because they're all really good schemes, by the way, but we've done them as the opportunities come along, as grant fundings become available or interest-free fundings become available. And with this one, we're looking at it because the opportunities come along. Kia's been exploring it. They want to reduce their carbon footprint. We need to reduce ours. It's something that's of mutual interest and it's a great benefit. But I think a really good point is, how do we know we're investing in the, you know, the best pounds per tonne for carbon reduction? Well, actually, that is a matrices that I think we should start to apply to all of our carbon schemes going forward, so we know that we're getting good value for money. But personally, for what could end up being 30-odd thousand pound a year, nearly 1,000 tonnes of carbon reduction is probably, in my view, one of the best that we're ever going to see. The other thing I'd point out is, you know, and just a little supplementary to carbon. Carbon's really important, you know, and that protects the environment for future generations. But you know, that hydrogenated vegetable derived fuel is a cleaner material. It also burns less nitrous oxides, you know, stuff that can cause children and others to develop respiratory problems. Respiratory diseases later in life are linked to the nitrous oxides in the environment that are given out by diesel trucks, etc. And it's got lower levels, so there are other supplementary benefits. So for me, that investment is an absolute no-brainer. It's a really huge environmental benefit for a relatively small amount of money. But I agree. I think having a matrices of measures so you can see how that fits in the scale of things is something we should do going forward.
Thank you, Zach. Yeah, I'm conscious of time, so I appreciate that this item is it deserves detailed scrutiny. However, if members could keep their questions and officers and cabinet members could keep their responses as succinct as possible, I would appreciate it. So I'll return to Councillor Williams.
Thanks very much. On that, we didn't get an idea of the costs. Now, for this to be transparent, members, BCBC members and members of the public should have an idea of how much it's costing to purchase back these vehicles. But with these vehicles, so the new contractor would potentially be using old BCBC vehicles, whilst they're not old, you've said, but they'd be about 4 to 6.5 years old. So who would be liable for the breakdown costs and any delays? Would that fall with BCBC, or would the new contractor be responsible for fixing? And then what's the risk provision for that? And then I've got a final section of questions, and then I'll leave it for everyone else. Okay.
Okay, I'll bring in Zach to answer that question, then you can have your final set of questions, Councillor Williams.
Yeah, so all you know, the new contractor would run and maintain the vehicles. They would operate them under their O license. They would be responsible for all day-to-day maintenance. It's pretty standard in the industry sector. I've run contracts myself, North Somerset, where we ran vehicles that the local authority had passed over to a contractor when I worked as a contractor in the sector. Not in any way unusual, that, so that's how it would happen. Well, in fact, it actually already happens on the contract. So the AHP collection vehicles are vehicles that we purchased with Welsh Government grant funding, and Kia now operate those in much the same way. So, you know, to an extent, it already happens slightly on the contract. So.
Okay, thank you, Zach. Councillor Williams, your final set of questions?
Yeah, it's finally, sorry, on staff that transfer over. So we'd to pay the Kia staff in 2024, is that right? And then potentially have to do this again in 2026 if we were to bring it in-house. So what would be the cost of doing that twice as opposed to doing it once? Thanks.
Okay, Zach.
I mean, I think it's fair to ask what would the cost of the procurement be, you know, in two short periods of time. In terms of TUPE staff, it happens between the existing contractor and the new contractor. So there isn't a direct cost that we would see or have visibility of between those two bodies.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Gebby would like to come in, I believe. Deputy Leader.
Thank you very much, Councillor Williams. I am sorry, it's taken me a while to get my buttons to work this morning. Just to reassure Councillor Williams, there is no cost to any TUPE transfer. It is a direct transfer of staffing arrangements, and in a minute you become an employee from one organisation to another. But just for some reassurance, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. We will now go to any other member who has called in the decision who sits on the committee. Otherwise, I'll bring in other committee members in the order in which they've raised their hands. Would anyone else like to speak who's a member of the committee and has called in the decision? No, I can't see any hands raised, so we'll go to other committee members now, and we have Councillor Tim Thomas who's raised his hand.
Thanks, Chair. Just listening to this debate and previous debates that we've had on waste management, it seems pretty clear to me that waste management contracts appear to be significantly less lucrative to the commercial sector, and that could be for a variety of challenges and legislation. I'm just wondering if, you know, any decision that we do take, whether it be short term or going forward more long term, I'm just would like some reassurance if that there's a contingency plan in place should any short-term plans fall by the wayside. For example, Mark, I think Mark did say that Kia want to exit the sector, and that does lead me to some quite, you know, big concerns. Obviously, private sector organisations do make decisions quickly, and I just want some reassurance that, you know, if they did exit the market, what would we have in place to ensure the longevity of service? Obviously, the collection of waste is a massive public health issue. So I'm just wondering what plans, hopefully it wouldn't happen, but what plans could be put in place to ensure longevity of service, if any risks, such as the contractor discontinued service?
Okay, Mark Shepherd, CEO.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Thomas. A valid question. I mean, they've been very public about withdrawing from this part of their business. So it's not just a Bridgend issue; it'd be an issue wherever they held such contracts. They are contractually committed to provide the service to us till 2024. There is no indication that they will not do so. In fact, quite the opposite. They seem very committed to going out on good terms. To answer your question, obviously, the reason for procuring the short-term contract is to ensure that at that point in 2024, we had an alternative in place. However, which I think is where the gist of your question was coming from, there are provisions that local authorities can make in emergency situations, particularly on services such as this, where if for whatever reason there was no means of providing the service through normal practice, we could, I don't think we've got any lawyers with us, but we could, under our provisions in an emergency situation without procurement, simply ask someone to pick up the slack and provide a service for us on a very short-term basis. We could ask a neighbouring authority under mutual aid. So all of those kind of things. But let me stress, they are meant to be emergency situations. They're not something you do as a matter of course. In fact, you wouldn't want to be in that position because you'd very much be at the beck and call of whoever was helping you out. But I think if that's what you were getting at, there are those emergency provisions. But obviously what we're doing is doing everything we can to ensure that we don't get into an emergency situation by procuring at this point, and we'd know well before the actual end of the contract in 2024, by procuring people to take over that contract provision from 2024 until 2026.
Absolutely. That was a sort of nuclear scenario I was painting there. But it is reassuring that there are some there's some something to fall back on there. I just wonder if we looked at a sort of formal risk strategy, if you like, for this decision as well. Is all the risks, potential risks over this 2-year period been identified?
Mark.
I'm happy to answer if there's no one else coming forward. Yes, obviously the risk assessment has been part of the process of making the recommendation to Cabinet. Again, I think it's important that I'm very open and honest with you here. I said something in answer to an earlier question to Councillor Williams that we can anticipate that one of the risks is that the cost is going to go up. In fact, it would be odd if it didn't, on the basis that every other contract the council is currently procuring, certainly ones that involve fuel and vehicles, is going up significantly. So one risk is that there will be an increase in cost. I should point out, I think that would be the case whoever provided it, because I think simply the cost of providing the contract would have gone up. There is a risk, potentially, of no one bidding. There is always a risk in a procurement of no one bidding. But again, to mitigate and treat that risk, we have taken the precaution of talking to the market, talking to the relevant companies on a soft market testing basis. And the indication is that because it's relatively simple for them, because the vehicles are in place, the methodology is in place, that there is an interest in the market in providing it. So just to give you, some highlights, there is clearly a risk assessment that is carried out. I think our overview is that this is potentially the least risky option if we do pursue the contract, because we've already explained that to try and rush potentially an in-housing type approach within the period is potentially more risky. I'm not saying it's impossible, that will remain to be seen, but there are risks with all these things. So I hope I've highlighted and answered your question sufficiently. Thank you.
And just finally, Mark, if I may, I was going to ask a question on public consultation. Just listening to the debate again as well, it's a bit clearer in my mind now why that wasn't implemented. But you have reassured me on the necessity to have public consultation in the long term. I'm just hoping that that will include a variety of measures, because obviously waste management affects everyone, doesn't it, really? And you know, we won't just go for the traditional log your comments on a website sort of thing. We will go into the community and you know, do real public meaningful consultation.
If I may, Chair, just to answer that, thank you.
Yes, please do.
Yes, there isn't a necessity for public consultation if you're largely keeping the methodology the same, which I think is the point you were making. So not for the two-year contract, but absolutely. If we came along with, for example, either an in-house contract or a 7-year contract in 2026, the chances are that some of the methodology would have to change, particularly if Welsh Government at that point said, you've got to meet a 90% recycling target or a 100% recycling target, then clearly you would have to potentially collect additional waste streams. You might have to look at how the methodology changed. You might have less frequent residual collections, all the things, incidentally, some authorities have already had to enter into. At that point, to move to that position would require comprehensive public consultation and engagement and information, because a lot of this would be new, and our experience is that changing waste methodology, not just our experience incidentally, I think every local authority's experience, is it's always reasonably difficult, reasonably complex, and requires skillful consultation. So to reassure you, Councillor Thomas, absolutely yes, that would happen at that point.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I think Zach would like to come in, and then
yeah, it was just on that consultation point, and yes, absolutely agree. You know, when we get to the stage where we're looking to change the service to the public, which no doubt, you know, as recycling targets keep going up, we will need to look to do, then absolutely, you know, everything Mark said about the consultation, you know, the public consultation will be needed. And just to reiterate, when we did this last time, so last time when we changed the service and we introduced the 2-bag rule, etc., there was a lot of public consultation that was done at that time. The team learned a lot from it. And we didn't just do the online tick box exercise. We did all sorts of things. There was stuff on Bridge FM. We had little engagement fires in supermarket exit points where we actually had staff that were engaging with the public, you know, throughout the borough as they were doing their shopping. Also, there was a whole range of engagement exercises that we did back then. You know, it's a real challenge because really contentious change at that time, although well accepted now, and we absolutely would look to do that full range of involved consultation and engagement exercises again when we get to that stage when we're looking to actually see what the service looks like going forward.
Okay, thank you very much, Zach. We'll move on now to a question from Councillor Ross Pennell-Thomas.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair, and thank you also for the contributions of colleagues thus far. I think my biggest concerns here are the time frame, the cost, and in particular with cost, the value for money. So let's be perfectly honest amongst ourselves, were it not for COVID, the cost of living pressures and also inflation, the type of procurement process and the cost of delivery would be much less. So with that in mind, and some of the conversations that have taken place in other scrutiny meetings, so for example, with the Communities Directorate, crossing points were estimated at a cost of £80,000, and one tender came back at 3 times the amount. So would it not be wise then to be exploring other options, notwithstanding what Zach has already said in terms of the lack of capacity and resource in the procurement team? Would it not be wise to be exploring those other options alongside now testing the market so that we end up with value for money in the long run, and that we aren't lumbered as an authority with a 2-year contract that quite literally cost an arm and a leg? So I think my point here is how strong is the value for money case, whereby we end up possibly making a decision on any old contract at whatever cost that comes back at. Where is that in terms of the thinking and the assessment of Cabinet and officers? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Pennell-Thomas. Bringing Mark Shepherd.
Thank you, Councillor Pennell-Thomas. Yeah, a valid question. I think hopefully I answered this earlier, or certainly in part. I think if I start at the beginning, what we're all going to agree on, I hope, is that we have to provide a waste contract. And so with a limited amount of time until 2024, our options are relatively limited. So essentially, we're either going to procure an outside contractor to provide it with all the risks that you described and the additional costs, or if there's sufficient time, we can potentially bring it in-house. And what I think was said earlier is that we are exploring the option of bringing it in-house, but you've also heard from other contributors that have told us that the timescales left are very, very tight. And incidentally, because of our position, and I described that we haven't had staff or infrastructure to run a contract in-house since 2003, that would also be incredibly expensive. So Zach has described how we would need to engage additional teams. It wouldn't just be service professionals, it would be in legal, in procurement, etc., to bring the service in-house. So there are no options that don't carry risks. We think, and having soft market tested and spoken to the main players in the market, we think that this is the least risky option. But as I say, just to reiterate, just for the avoidance of doubt, the likelihood is that any contractor will come in with an increased cost, because that is just the nature of what's happening in that market at the moment, but what's also happening in every market at the moment, particularly where contracts include vehicles and fuel. So I suppose what I'm saying, Councillor Williams, in summary, is that there are limited options available because we have a limited amount of time until the end of the existing contract. They all carry an element of risk, but on assessment, we think this is the most sensible option because it is the easiest. It is the least expensive at our end, but I take the point that obviously the market will dictate what the cost is, and we will then have to assess at that point whether that is value for money. And meanwhile, in parallel, we will be carrying out work to determine, because I think it's good practice to have an alternative, isn't it, to a contractor that's trying to charge a lot of money. We will also be saying, yeah, we've done some work in parallel, and we may have to take up that option and accelerate that option if we feel that whatever the market comes back with is unacceptable.
Thank you, Mark. Zach, would you like a supplementary to that?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm just trying to get my camera to come back on. It doesn't seem to want to at the moment. So. I don't know why. Oh, there we are. I'm sure you're all much happier now. You can see me. I couldn't get my camera to turn back on. Yeah, just to add to the points that Mark raised, and probably just bring in a little bit of personal perspective on this one. I mean, you know, in my position as head of service, I cover a lot of industry sort of sections, but this is the one that I particularly was from in terms of my own personal background. I spent many years working in this environment, you know, waste collections. And what I can say is it's always been a pretty fiercely competitive marketplace. So going out to tender typically gets you best value. Now, that doesn't mean there might not be a really significant increase in costs, because everyone knows about LGV driver shortages. You know, that's well documented at a national level. Everyone knows about fuel price increases, you know, two things that you haven't been able to turn the telly on in recent years and months without hearing about them. So that is going to affect the cost of the contract. But what we need to be assured of is that we've got competition, and that there's going to be interest, and that those people putting those prices together are actually in competition with each other, sharpening their pencils, so to speak, to give us the best value that we can reasonably expect. And I think this industry sector, that has always been the case. It's been a little bit different with things that are aligned to construction, and there have been some examples in the construction sector where we've seen prices coming back where they've just absolutely flown up, you know, sort of multiple fold increases in costs. And frankly, you know, from talking to the suppliers in that sector, those sector areas, there's a level of work out there that means it's not competitive at the moment. You know, there's more work than there is ability to deliver. Hence, when people are putting forward prices, some of the values coming through, you know, aren't just representative of increasing costs. They're representative of an uncompetitive marketplace on occasion. In the waste sector, the number of suppliers and the number of contracts has been pretty consistent. That hasn't changed. So yes, there will be fundamental material cost uplifts that cause all of the bidders, and indeed, even if it is brought in-house, cause costs to go up. But I don't have a reason to be concerned that we shouldn't see competitiveness, which is what's important in securing best value that the authority can get.
Thank you, Zach. Just going to bring in Councillor Pennell Thomas again.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Williams. Just want to thank the officers for that those responses. I guess the uncomfortable thing here is that we're now operating in an environment where few of us consider anything value for money. So, you know, we're likely to be in a position where we have huge costs versus absolutely astronomical costs, and we're going to have to make a case there for value for money. So, as Mark said, we're not really going to know that situation until a few months down the line, where envelopes and figures are actually on the table. So, it'll be really interesting to see what the market looks like as inflation heads north of 10%. Thanks, Councillor Williams, and thank you, Mark and Zach.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Paul Davis, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. A quick little point first, Chair. Just let the previous members might be aware, I'm one of these lauded HGV drivers in a former life. I actually drove a refuse lorry for 4 years back in the early 90s, so I do know a little bit about it. Tim Thomas stole my thunder, Chair. He asked the question, the Plan B question, basically. But I had another minor question I can put to the officers. The HVO, the hydrogenated vegetable oil, which they're proposing to use going forward, what is the sustainability of that and the availability is used forever and a day? I don't know where it comes from. I don't know anything about this stuff. You know, can you give us some background on this type of fuel? And you know, we're not going to run out of this stuff. I'm trying to say, if we did go down that road, would we be, you know, would it be a sustainable option for going forward?
Thank you, Councillor Davis. Zach Shaw.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, the hydrogenated vegetable oil, it's basically the next stage in vegetable oil derived fuels. They originally had sort of a similar version of these fuels, came out a number of years ago with sort of vehicles running off converted chip fat from the chippies that would be collected and then worked on and turned into a form of diesel that vehicles used to run off. Technology's moved on, the science has moved on, and we're now talking about a much more refined process with a much higher grade fuel that's coming out. And a lot of the supply sources are different. Quite often, sometimes waste crop is used as one of the main supply sources in the chain. Exactly where it's going to come from and the exact origins is going to come out of the negotiation with Kia. You know, that is to be determined, but yes, it seems there is an adequate and plentiful supply of this fuel. But I would highlight, we are only looking at this as an interim step. This isn't the long-term solution for how we're going to reduce our carbon footprint as we see it at the moment. Ultimately, you know, everything is pointing at the future being either electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell powered vehicles. You know, that's the longer term solution. This is just something that we're looking at as a few year quick fix, good win, huge benefit for a relatively small investment. And it stops us burning a fossil fuel, stops us adding to the problems that come from that, lowers the hydrocarbon particulates that those vehicles knock out, and the nitrous oxide that I previously mentioned. So yes, we won't sign up to it if we're not sure there's adequate supply, good benefits, but it is just an interim step. It's not the end solution. It's not the ultra low emission vehicle solution. We will look to get better than this eventually, but a really good quick step and a quick win, so to speak. And
thanks, Zach.
I think if the member wants to go back in trucks, he could earn some good money doing that at the moment. If he wants to go back there at the moment, given the shortage.
I'm open to offer, Zach. Thank you, Chair, and thanks for a good explanation there, Zach. That's much appreciated.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you, Councillor Davis.
I won't labour the point any further. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think Councillor Rees-Good, Cabinet Member for Wellbeing and Future Generations, would like to come in.
Thank you, Chair, and just to reiterate, colleagues, congratulations to you in your election. Just to add to Zach's point a little bit, I have asked officers as well, in terms of the fuel that we do find for these vehicles, that we do try and look at procuring it through the most sustainable way possible, so that it is coming from waste crop, etc., so that we do double down on achieving as much of an impact on the economies and the savings in terms of our carbon as possible. So that is something that I know Janine and Zach are looking at. So just as a bit of a reassurance to members who might be concerned, that we are looking at that and we are trying to ensure that it's done as sustainably as possible and saves as much carbon as possible. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Good. Moving to Councillor Simon Griffiths now for his contribution.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question is really around the risk points that have been made earlier, but I think we are possibly underestimating the cost risk that we are taking on with a 2-year procurement proposal. Back in 2017, the Competition and Markets Authority looked at how long it took waste companies to recover their sunk costs as part of the procurement and the setup costs, and they were looking at a minimum of 5 years for that cost to be regained by the supplier. And my concern here is that although companies may be willing to bid for 2 years, what they're going to have to do is put costs which are usually spread over 5 years into 2 years, which will increase their proposals to us. So my question here is that are we likely to have not only a cost of living increase in it, but because of our strategy around it, a 2-year contract, we're also leaving ourselves open to much higher costs because we're asking for 2 procurements or two proposals, which means the suppliers have to do those within 2 years. So and as a result, I think it's quite possible that we're in a position where although we may get bidders, as Mark Shepherd has indicated, that those may be exorbitant costs for the council. And what I would encourage us to do is to have a very solid contingency plan if that circumstance was to arise. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Griffiths. We have a trio of officers waiting to come in now to answer your questions. So I'll go to the CEO first, Mark Shepherd.
Yeah, hopefully I can answer that, Councillor Griffiths, and thank you again for the questions. I think it is valid that I reinforce and reiterate something. I think the point you make about ordinarily companies making a profit off for 5 years is certainly the information I have, but on longer term contracts, which is why normal waste contracts are for 7 years. That is the norm within the industry. I think what we're talking about here is something, and this has been picked up, as I say, in our soft market testing. What we're talking about here is we're saying to a company's already in the market, you can pick up a contract here using the same methodology, established, embedded, the same vehicles, and the transfer of the staff who are already providing it. So what we're essentially saying, this is a reasonably simple contract for you to provide because you're in the market already, you'll already have procured your waste streams, and therefore the evidence we have is on that basis, as Zach has described, we're likely to get competition because they will, as I indicated earlier, let's not be naive, they still believe they can make a profit out of that contract. So while I've explained, I think there is a risk, I think this isn't something where they have to take a long-term view. It isn't something where they have to invest huge amounts at the beginning to make it work. This is something much, much simpler, where we're saying to people already in the market, here's something that's reasonably simple for you, something you'll be used to doing, and therefore you can make a profit for a 2-year term. And let's be honest again, I imagine that if the authority took a decision to procure a longer term contract after those 2 years, they would probably also imagine that they'd be in a stronger position because they'd probably be thinking that they have an affinity with the authority and a knowledge of routes and local factors. So I hope that reassures you. I don't in any way dismiss what you're saying, because I have the same information about long-term contracts, but we are talking about something slightly different here.
If I could just come back, I think the second point I was making, Mark, was around a contingency plan. And what I'm really highlighting is that the risk of being in a situation where we don't have a cost-efficient solution is relatively high. So that really puts an onus on us to put a contingency plan in place if that circumstance were to occur.
And if I may, Chair, just very briefly, that plays to Councillor Pennell-Thomas's point really about and in parallel, therefore, we do need to have something that we think we can fall back on in particular circumstances. But I suppose the point I would make is that once you've outsourced any contract, actually, you're not just talking about waste here, you're always to some extent as an organisation in that risky situation, aren't you? So I suppose what I'm saying is we either take the risk of procuring a contract with an external provider, or similarly, we have the risk of bringing something back in-house that hasn't been in-house for a long, long time, and all of the investment that would be required to bring that in. I honestly don't think there is a third option that doesn't carry some level of risk. So we are in that position. That is where we are. And therefore we have to manage that risk in the most effective way, which I think is the point you're making. So yes, I agree.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mark.
Okay. Thanks very much, Mark. Zach.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just coming back to that point about the setup costs being significant and then typically spread over a number of years. And if you haven't got that number of years to spread it, you know, sort of making a 2-year contract excessively expensive. I mean, I've led bids from a commercial side on waste contracts for local authorities a number of times, and your big setup cost areas are: one, there's a huge capital investment in vehicles typically associated with a contract that does need to be spread over a period of time. Our contract's not going to have that because we're fundamentally supplying the, you know, 99% of the fleet. They may decide that they need 1 or 2 backup vehicles just to provide some extra assurance, but we're basically giving them a fleet, so they haven't got that big setup cost. The secondary setup cost then comes in the route planning. And it is quite significant. There's an awful lot of work goes into seeing those vehicles. We all see them drive around the streets collecting from our houses on whatever day of the week it is. Seems relatively straightforward, but the amount of planning that goes into those routes is really extensive. You need planning software, and lots of man hours in the bid teams goes into routing those vehicles, deciding on the most efficient routes, give an allowance per property for time when they need to go to tip. And when you think about it, when you've got all of those vehicles operating different routes each day, so the number of routes that you have to map out is really extensive. It's probably on our contract somewhere in the region of about 200 individual different routes that all cover, you know, sort of hundreds and hundreds of properties. We're not going to have contractors do that element of work because we're saying we want the same services we've got now. We don't want the public disruption. We don't want the service to fundamentally change. We don't want the work rerouted. Here's the existing infrastructure. Here's the existing vehicles. Here's the existing rounds. So that upfront investment that's needed, both in management time and vehicles, isn't there. So in terms of getting a cost-efficient contract, a lot of that investment that would be paid off over the life of the contract doesn't exist. So yes, coming back to costs will go up because the cost base has absolutely gone up. But in terms of that point about the upfront investment that typically has to be paid off, and I'm fully aware I've priced these contracts as a private contractor many times, we are taking most of that away because of the nature of this short-term contract. So I think that was it.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Griffiths, are you content with that response, or would you like to come back?
If I may make a more general question, I'm struggling a little bit to understand why it's so easy for a new supplier to come in and do a 2-year contract, and why it's so hard for us as an authority to do what is essentially the same thing. Maybe it's my naivety, but I understand there are contractual and there are supply contracts and all that sort of stuff. But I think there's 2 sides to this, which if it's easy for another company to do it, do we have an option of setting up an arm's length company to do the same thing that that these suppliers might do for us? So I'm a bit confused about why it's easy for them and very, very hard and impossible for us to do the same thing in 2 years.
Thank you, Councillor Griffiths. Mark?
If I can clarify that, because this is really important, actually, is that this is fairly fundamental. When Zach spoke earlier, the reason it's much more difficult for us is that if we bring it back in-house, we don't have any of that same expertise, infrastructure, or indeed existing procurements for all of the waste streams. So Zach spoke earlier about 76 different procurements that we would have to bring on board if we were to bring it back in-house. Clearly, the big suppliers in the market will have an awful lot of what we don't have already in place because they'll be running other contracts throughout the country. So I think trying to keep it simple and short as you've requested, Chair, that's the fundamental difference between us bringing it back in-house and someone else potentially running the contract as is.
If I may have one final follow-up, since Kia are exiting the business, wouldn't it be possible for them to novate most of their existing 70 contracts to us as part of that transfer, and for us to take them on and continue with almost exactly the same service that Kia offers?
Yeah, Mark?
It may well be in some cases. I think Zach described earlier that there's a combination of different procurements, some of which are waste streams, some of which are software, some of which are routing. I don't imagine it's possible in all cases, but I suppose I come back to the point about in parallel, which I think was your original point, in parallel to this procurement, there's also an element of feasibility that we need to undertake so that we are progressing, for example, the in-house option, one in the case of the procurement being unsuccessful or unacceptable to us, but secondly, the point that was raised earlier on, in preparation anyway for 2026, we need to progress in a lot of those elements, recognizing that some of them take a long time. So the innovation argument may well be suitable for some, but I very much doubt for all.
I think it is worth us looking at, Mark, if that is possible as part of our contingency plans. And I think it would be wise for us to do that, given the risk of either a high bid or, in fact, even no bid. So.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Griffiths. Thank you, Mark. Councillor Tim Thomas.
Thanks, Chair. We've spoken widely about the challenges to the potential contractor, mainly concentrated on the escalated costs. One thing I just want to briefly explore is the potential that the service could deteriorate. So my question is, will we be outlining clear standards that need to be met? And if these standards aren't met, could there be a possibility of penalties or sanctions being used to deter the quality of the service not being maintained?
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. Zach?
That's just a simple one. Yes, that is something we'll be putting into the contract.
Okay, thank you. Do I have any other contributions from members? Councillor Thomas, your hand is still raised. Would you like to come back in, or are you content with the response? No. Just a couple of remarks from me, if I may. Just to summarise, from what officers and cabinet members have said, I'm going to correct me if I'm wrong, that you believe that the corporate risks and value for money concerns which some of the councillors have raised are minimised, and you're confident that you'll have a competitive tender process because you are essentially keeping the service as is. Just a couple of other questions from me, if I may, referring to page 60 and 61 and page 62 of our packs. As has been mentioned by a number of cabinet members and officers, officers presented a report to the Overview and Scrutiny Committee 3 on the options and risks of progressing with a new contract post 2024. This was last year. What recommendations did the Overview and Scrutiny Committee make, and how have they been incorporated into this cabinet report? And of course, on page 62, it mentions that the Corporate Management Board considered what might be achievable and deliverable in the timescale and circumstances. And these were internal discussions, and one preferred option was presented to Cabinet. Can all of the options be put into the public domain and issued to this committee for their consideration? Thanks. Councillor Spanswick.
Thank you, Chair. Particularly, I was thinking of just coming to the end of this part, so I was going to just refer back to the actual cabinet report and a particular paragraph in there which sums up where we are at present, and there's been some great sort of questions and answers and some good debate on this topic, and there's a lot more to come in the future. But paragraph 3.5 of the report says that the short-term interim contract period will allow time for the development of a complex future waste collection model post-26, including key decisions around how the service will be provided to be made at a time when there'll be less uncertainty. This will ensure that the most cost-effective service and innovative technology is deployed, which is critical if Council to achieve its ambition of being the best recycling and waste service in Wales. So lastly, it says the Council will work on the interim contract and in parallel use this time to look at all service delivery options available, including a new contractual arrangement or bringing the service back in-house, possibly via an arm's length arrangement. Just want to reiterate that decision has not been made yet. There's a lot more discussion and presumably a lot more scrutiny to take place. So I welcome the position we're in today and working with you as scrutiny chair. And my apologies. Congratulations on being appointed chair of the corporate scrutiny. Plenty of work coming there in the future when we get to the budget as well. But
yeah, thanks very much, Councillor Spansby. But just from my perspective, this particular call-in and decision which has been made by Cabinet isn't relating necessarily to the 2026 process. It's relating to the short-term contract up until 2024. So in relation to this particular call-in and referring to the questions which I've posed, is it correct to say that you're content that there's going to be a competitive tender process in the short period of time which we have, which will mitigate the corporate risks and the possibility that we're left with a situation whereby we have to accept the highest tender because it's just the only option on the table to provide a waste service. I believe that is what has been said by officers and cabinet members, that you're satisfied in that because we're simply asking for the service level to continue as is, that you will have that competitive tender process, but it's still going to be a corporate risk which we're going to have to navigate over the course of the next 2 years. Those are my questions. And how, as I said, has the recommendations from last year's scrutiny report been incorporated into the cabinet report? And as I mentioned, would all of the options which the corporate management board that they've considered be available for the committee to review?
yeah, and thank you, Chair. And I apologize if I didn't answer that fully. But we're not going to wait until 2024 to start looking at the other options. The other options, which could be an arm's length company, are starting to be looked at now. So if we end up in a position in 2024 where we dare to say the bids are excessive, or we're almost one bid which is not competitive, we might not be at the stage there and then, but we may have to press the turbo button and accelerate the process to bring things back in-house, because we'll have these prices before 2024. So there is other work going on in parallel. We won't be left with just the one option. I'm determined that there will be another option, albeit it'll be a cost to the resource to making it happen, but that has got to be there as a safety net.
Okay, I'll bring Zach in shortly, but I reiterate for the third time, are all of the corporate management board's options available for the public domain and for this committee to consider? Because only one preferred option was presented towards for cabinet to consider, not all of the preferred options. So can someone from corporate management board potentially answer that question? Perhaps chief executive or the corporate director of communities? Yeah, Mark, please.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer. I'm not sure whether Zach was going to, so apologies, Zach, if I've jumped in before you. So just to reiterate, and I don't have, unfortunately, the scrutiny paper in front of me. So at the time of the scrutiny committee, the clear preferred option was a 2-year extension to the existing Kier contract, which is the point I made earlier. So I haven't got it in front of me, so I don't actually know what the recommendations were, so I can't tell you specifically whether they've been picked up, but important context that we were in a different time frame. Therefore, the paper that went to Corporate Management Board Cabinet in December was at the point when it became clear that Kier had told us they were moving out of the market, and therefore at that point there was a limited timescale to consider their options. So certainly we can show you what went through at that point, but I think the point I'm trying to make here is the timescales dictated that there weren't that many options. Essentially, the options are that you procure someone separately for that 2-year term, or, as we've described, in parallel, we seek to bring it in-house, but with all the caveats that have already been explained about the fact that we are advised that would be incredibly rushed in that period. So happy to share that isn't an issue, but I think it's important that you understand the extent of that is that it's not looking at 15 different options, because there aren't 15 different options in the timescale. But happy to share that if that's helpful.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful, because I think the whole point, from my perspective, in observing this particular item on our agenda today, is that the call-in is founded upon a single preferred option being presented for Cabinet to consider, rather than a series of options on which they could actually consider and make a decision on. So I think it would be interesting to see corporate management boards service continuation models which they considered and rejected, and then put forward their preferred option for Cabinet's approval. So I think that would provide some clarity to members and aid the scrutiny process further. So unless you want to comment on that, Mark, I can bring Zach in. It's entirely up to you.
No, I'm content. I mean, again, I will have to revisit the paper. I don't know what's in it, but I'm sure
Okay.
A version of it can certainly be presented publicly.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mark. Zach?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so as Mark has just committed to, there was that report of the 21st of December to corporate management, or CCMB as it was, that you know, where considerations can be shared. The point that you made, I was specifically coming in on the point about the outcomes from the scrutiny meeting in July that you mentioned. I mean, it's quite ironic, actually. The outcomes, as I recall it, was that there was quite a lot of challenge around, because the thrust of that was we were going to extend for 2 years with Kia. I think at that point in time, given that we had extensive discussion and argument around why that 2-year period was the most sensible, because of all of the uncertainties, Welsh Government legislation changes, Welsh Government recycling targets, ultra-low emission place vehicles development, that short-term arrangement was sensible. The main challenge and thrust came from, well, why aren't you looking to procure that, as opposed to give Kia an extension to make sure you get best value? Because maybe if we went to the marketplace, we'd get better value than just giving Kia an extension. So I think the actual outcome from the scrutiny meeting was basically a recommendation that the body didn't support the extension because they weren't convinced that that gave best value. Now the subsequent direction given by Cabinet at the time was, for all of the logical reasons that had been presented in the report, to continue with that extension. The irony is, because Kia now don't want to extend, we're actually in a position we're doing exactly what scrutiny recommended, which is going out for the short-term procurement, which is what scrutiny on the 21st of July asked for anyway. So ironically, we are doing exactly what scrutiny asked for, but in truth, not out of choice. We're doing it because Kia didn't want the extension. So I think that's clear.
Okay, yeah, that's very useful context, Zach. Thank you very much. Can I ask whether there are any other contributors? No. Okay. So if there are no other questions, invitees who are not required for the next report may leave the meeting, and the 2 non-committee members who signed the call-in may remain in the meeting but cannot take part in the decision. I will now ask the committee, if having regard to whether it is satisfied with the responses, if it wishes to A, refer the decision back to Cabinet for reconsideration, setting out the reasons and rationale for this request, or B, decide not to refer the matter back to the Cabinet. So do we have a mover and seconder for one of those proposals, one or either of those proposals, in fact? Councillor Amanda Williams.
Sorry, thanks very much. I think, based on what's been given, I'm still not satisfied with the report. I think I would like to see it go back with some recommendations in that report that include that they are being explicit that they're looking at other options for this 2-year period, not just going down this one route. I also am uncomfortable still with the delegated authority, because we don't know, they've said, the cost. So I think Cabinet should be looking at the cost of buying back this equipment and make that decision, because we haven't as well had a viable alternative option. So I reiterate again, costs must be transparent to us and our residents at this specific time where nobody has any money. So I would like to see those recommendations. Thanks.
Okay, so Councillor Amanda Williams has moved item A, that we refer the decision back to Cabinet for reconsideration, setting out her reasons and the rationale for the request. Do we have a seconder for that proposal?
Councillor Martin Jones has his hand up, Chair.
Yes, Councillor Martin Jones. Thank you, Meryl.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and I'll just endorse comments from previous colleagues. Congratulations on being chair of this very important, I would say, scrutiny committee. Please bear with me, I'm a little bit hoarse, but I'll try my best to just present what I've picked up this morning, Chair. I think what I've picked up this morning is the importance of scrutiny. This morning, we've had a number of quality and detailed questions which reinforce the value of scrutiny before corporate decision making. I don't know why scrutiny wasn't applied to the decision-making process that was undertaken by Cabinet in June, and I don't want to go there, but perhaps the lesson that should be learned is the value of scrutiny, because of course, if we don't engage with scrutiny, then there's ambiguity, there's a lack of knowledge and understanding, which then develops and creates dissatisfaction. This morning, Chair, I've been reassured that the Cabinet Member for Communities is focused. He's made comments about looking at best value, best service. This has been endorsed by the Chief Executive, and this has also been endorsed by the Operations Manager, Zach Shell. Now, I would support the report as it stands, but I would put a recommendation in there, Chair, and my recommendation is very much focused on paragraph 915 of the report received by Cabinet, and which was raised by the Deputy Leader, Councillor Jane Gevy. And that says, future waste service models, commission specialist advice if required, and report back to Cabinet on the new service model as developed. Can I suggest that specialist advice and any commissioning processes report back to this scrutiny so we can look at it before then it goes on to Cabinet? And the other thing that I've picked up as well is we last looked at this in July 2021 by another scrutiny committee. So there's an issue of ownership. And I propose that this committee takes ownership. This committee places on our forward work programme. We support the report that has been presented, but our recommendation is that any further development comes back to this committee so that we can take forward the representations and the proposals and perhaps then add some value to the corporate decision-making process thereafter. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your contribution. Councillor Freya Bledsoe, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can I just come in and second Amanda Williams's proposal, please?
That is to refer the decision back to Cabinet for reconsideration. Do you want to set out your rationale for the request?
Yes, because I think it just needs further looking at in that forum, please, if possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bledsoe. I believe Councillor Martin Jones, you were actually moving the decision to not refer the matter back to Cabinet, but with the caveat that that recommendation was added. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, Chair. I think we're in a position now where we have to accept the report. We don't have to. I mean, I accept the views of other members, but we're in a position where we have to accept where we are and the information that's contained within that report. So we accept the report, but we put a recommendation in that any further development in relation to this key area of business comes back to this scrutiny. So we can apply the same rigorous scrutiny that we've done this morning in relation to any moves forward in relation to commissioning services for waste.
Thank you for that clarification, Councillor Jones. I just needed to know if you were moving the second option. Councillor Simon Griffiths. Councillor Griffiths.
Having problems with my mute.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has come strongly through all of the conversations today is the timeliness of this decision of this process. What I'm a little bit concerned about, if we were to push this back, it would take another 2 or 3 months for a decision to be made, and then we've lost very valuable time when time is of the essence. So I'd like to actually make an amendment maybe to the motion, where we actually do accept the motion, put a requirement that it gets added to by contingency measures, and also a deeper look at the other options. But in terms of the report itself, I don't see any need that we need to push back and reject this, but we can accept it and put the additional recommendations on top. So I'd like to move that as an amendment to the original motion, please.
Thank you for that recommendation. I don't believe we are able to accept any amendments, but I'm sure I'll be corrected. However, I would just point out to members that if a decision is made to refer it back to Cabinet, a Cabinet meeting must be convened within 7 working days to reconsider the report. So it wouldn't take 2 to 3 months if it were to be sent back to Cabinet. It is constitutionally, they're constitutionally obliged to convene a meeting within 7 working days. Is there a formal seconder to Councillor Jones's movement that it is not sent back to Cabinet? Either Councillor Griffiths' hand still up as a legacy hand, or Councillor Bennett would like to come in. Councillor Bennett.
I would like to second the proposal that Councillor Martin Jones has put forward. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a division. So I'll bring in the scrutiny officers or democratic services to administer a vote, I assume, Rachel?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I just wanted to see whether Councillor Griffiths wanted to put a separate motion in, or whether he was happy to support Councillor Jones's.
Oh, is that permissible, Rachel? I don't know the constitution.
Well, in terms of him actually saying it goes back to Cabinet, that is fine. There can be recommendations where maybe future things are looked at, for example, because it's not relating to the actual decision. That's fine. May not be an amendment to that decision, because if it has to be amended, it would have to go back, as you rightly said.
Yes.
But if he's talking about future aspects to look at, that would be okay as a recommendation.
I think from my perspective, Rachel, and I seek your advice on this. Clearly, Councillor Jones and Councillor Griffiths have made recommendations which need to go back to Cabinet for the consideration. However, that would be potentially impossible if they were to move the motion that it does not go back. So
yeah, but if they are, as I said, if they are kind of recommendations that can go to future Cabinet, that's absolutely fine, because it's not, they're actually saying that the decision goes through. If they're happy for the decision to go through, then that is absolutely fine. You can kind of say that, I mean, Councillor Jones's particularly is relating to forward aspects.
Yes, yeah.
If Councillor Simon Griffiths is happy for those aspects to be picked up as a future aspect, that's fine. If he's talking about an amendment, as you rightly say, it would have to go back. So I was just checking whether there was a seconder or anything for Councillor Simon Griffiths, or whether he's happy to kind of support Councillor Martin Jones.
Yes, I'll support Martin Jones's proposal in that case. Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so on that basis, Rachel, there is a division.
There is.
Both motions have been moved and seconded, so I'll hand over to you to administer any particular vote on the subject.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm going to take Councillor Amanda Williams's motion first, please. But first of all, could I just do a quick roll call just to check who is actually in? So I check no one has left the meeting. Can I just have a quick yes on everyone attending? I'll go through. Councillor Heidi Bennett.
Yes.
Councillor Freya Bledsoe.
Yeah.
Councillor Paul Davis.
Yes.
Councillor Richard Granville.
Yes.
Councillor Simon Griffiths.
Yes.
Yes. Councillor Martin Hughes.
Yes.
Councillor Martin Jones.
Yes.
Councillor Penhill Thomas.
I'm here, thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. Councillor Tim Thomas. No. Councillor Tim Thomas. He left the meeting. Possibly. Councillor Graham Walter.
Yes.
Councillor Alex Williams, obviously.
Aye.
And Councillor Amanda Williams. Councillor Amanda Williams. You're on the list. Okay. I'll go through for motion
Sorry,
one.
I'm trying to find my, because I'm on my phone. I was trying to find my phone.
No problem, that's fine. I just want to double check. Councillor Tim Thomas is not in the meeting then.
He's still showing us in the meeting.
That's what I'm worried about. So I'll go through and I'll come back to the end maybe. So motion one, Councillor Amanda Williams is to refer back to Cabinet. I'll go through. Please say if you support the motion. Councillor Heidi Bennett.
Against.
Councillor Freya Bledsoe,
For.
sorry, that was a yes, wasn't it? Councillor Paul Davis,
Against.
Councillor Richard Granville,
Against.
Councillor Simon Griffiths,
Against.
Councillor Martin Hughes,
Against.
Councillor Martin Jones,
Against.
Councillor Ross Penhill Thomas,
For.
Councillor Tim, oh, I'll come back to that one. Councillor Graham Walter,
Against.
Councillor Alex Williams,
For.
and Councillor Amanda Williams.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you. And then obviously on Councillor Martin Jones's motion, motion 2, Councillor Heidi Bennett,
For.
Councillor Freya Bledsoe,
Against.
Councillor Paul Davis,
For Rachel.
Councillor Richard Granville,
For Rachel.
Councillor Martin Hughes,
For.
Councillor Simon Griffiths,
For.
Councillor Martin Jones,
Of course, for.
Councillor Ross Penhill Thomas,
Abstain.
Councillor Graham Walter,
For.
Councillor Alex Williams,
Abstain.
and Councillor Amanda Williams.
Against.
Okay, thank you. And can I just double check Councillor Tim Thomas isn't involved? We can't say that he was there for the meeting or for the discussions, so I will not include his vote. Based on the votes here, I can say that motion 1 has been carried. So Councillor Martin Jones. So can I just clarify?
Motion 2.
Sorry, correction. Thank you. Councillor Martin Jones's motion, motion 2, has been carried. Can I just clarify, Chair? So I have written down for that motion is that it gets sent back to Cabinet. The report is supported as it stands, with the caveat that for future we'll send a future report to Cabinet saying that any future development and any future waste service model be considered by scrutiny as pre-decision, receiving specialist advice that they mentioned in the report at 9.5, and that can before scrutiny before it comes to Cabinet. Thank you.
Okay, I'll ask Councillor Jones to just confirm that, but Councillor Paul Davis, do you want to raise a point of order or anything?
Yeah, it's a quick query, Chair. Thank you very much for indulging me. Are we, as Chair of Scrutiny Committee 3, where waste issues are normally dealt with, Rachel, are we saying here now that all things waste are going to come back to this committee, or just the matters of the contract and the waste contract we discussed today?
That is within the remit of this committee to determine, to be fair, but I would advise really that it would be just the contract, given the fact that Subject Committee 3 has got a big history in terms of looking at waste items, etc. And as I said, usually corporate would look at something like the contract, so it's within the committee's remit to determine that.
Thank you for that, Clardy. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
So, Councillor Jones, can you just confirm what has been said by Rachel is in line with your motion?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I totally agree with what Rachel has just presented to us. Can I just, if I may, Chair, just suggest this? This is a big issue. Procurement and tendering processes within the authority, and for all the right reasons, are under the spotlight publicly across the county borough. So if in any way we can retain this, we should retain ownership of this issue. I accept the role that has been played by Scrutiny Committee number 3, but the big issue of procurement and tendering, I think, should lay with corporate overview. And I hope, Chair, that I have your support in taking that forward. Thank you.
I personally concur with that, Councillor Jones, and unless there are any further contributions, that item has been concluded.
Sorry, Chair, can I just intervene?
Yes,
just
of course,
one
Rachel,
final
yes.
thing is obviously because this is a cabinet report going to go forward to a future committee, if the committee is happy, we can also include the comments that Councillor Griffiths wanted as well, which relates to if he's happy to relate them to future.
Yeah, I think that would be wise if Councillor Griffiths is in agreement.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Rachel.
Okay, thank you everyone for that. All your contributions on item number 5. It's now Councillor Graham Walter.
Thank you, Chair.
Councillor
I was going to suggest that perhaps, as we've been going for over 2 hours, we take a short comfort break before moving on.
You must be psychic, because that's exactly what I was going to suggest. So perhaps we can reconvene at 11:50, 10 to 12. That gives you a 10-minute break. Thank you, everyone.